Poem by Simon Armitage is deeply ambivalent. He creates a character that we partly like and partly dislike. The poem seems to be an experiment asking the question, what is man really like? Essentially good or essentially evil? Although when we reach the end of the poem, you may find that evil is too strong a term. Armitage begins unusually as though he's midway through a list, and the poem is in fact a list of all the things this man has done. The fact that it begins with "and" implies that we've heard many more things before, although of course we haven't. We're just arriving at this conversation. The first action, to shovel snow from a snow-covered drive, sounds very good-natured, but then we become slightly suspicious with this verb here. Instead of tipping it to the side, it is tossed. There's a certain carelessness and callousness in the action. And then we find out that he always tucked his daughter up at night, and this use of the word always suggests both great care but also an element of suspicion. We're not really sure if he trusts her, and if, in turn, we should trust him, because this is what he always does. Tucked becomes a controlling kind of action, not necessarily a supportive one. Our suspicions are confirmed here when he slaps her, but, perhaps in order to be kind, he uses a slipper rather than his hand, and this is for the one time that she lied. We are very critical of him for this, but we have to ask ourselves, is the fact that she only lied once because of this sort of treatment? Or is he deluded? Is this the only time he's caught her in a lie, and actually he never really understands her? And this is what I mean by ambiguity. We're led to believe certain things about him, but we're not sure if we can trust our beliefs. Next, he is attacked again through the use of verbs. He tipped up half his wage. This is an image that shows us how he drinks, and if it's half his wage, he's drinking excessively every day. And so we ask ourselves, is he coming home drunk every night and tucking his daughter into bed? How violent was this if he was drunk? Of course, he may not be drunk. He may be the kind of alcoholic who manages to cope with lots of drink and not appear drunk. Or he may not be drunk at all. He might just tip up half his wage at the weekend. Again, we're left uncertain about this man. And then there's a positive. What he doesn't spend each week, he saves. Another nice thing that he does is he praises his wife, not just once in a while, but for every meal she made, and we get a sense that she's probably cooking for him every night. So that sounds incredibly positive, but then we feel, hang on a minute, is she always having to cook for him? Is that her only role? And then we have this final line of the octet here, the octet being 8 lines, and once, for laughing, punched her in the face. This is a dramatic surprise to us. He's used real violence with his wife, and much worse than the slippering that he gave his daughter, where he was somewhat discreet, at least not using his hands. Here, he's not slapped his wife with his hand, which is bad enough, but actually punched her. This violence really takes us by surprise. When we come backwards, we suspect it's for laughing at him, or worse, simply for being happy. So when we get to the end of the octet here, we're convinced that he's an evil character. The sextet that's coming up changes things, however. Here he seems to genuinely love his mother, so much so that he doesn't just rely on the NHS, but spends money on a private nurse for her. He takes her to church every Sunday. But it doesn't sound as though he goes in with her. he simply drops her off, and that's why the verb taxied is there. He's very sad when she dies, or when she's dying, when she went from bad to worse, but the description of him isn't he cried or he sobbed, where we might have some sympathy, but he blubbed, something we might talk about with a child who is crying too much. There's something immature about him here. And then we get the twist, as we did with the final line of the octet. This quatrain here has got another twist, and twice he lifted 10 quid from her purse. He's stolen from his mother. Not just once, but twice, which is why I've underlined it again. Remember, he once punched his wife and he once slippered his daughter. Now we begin to see a pattern in the way that he treats women, and so even his mother, who he appears to love the most here, he still steals from. The amount he's stolen, 10 quid, seems inconsequential, and Armitage calls it quid instead of pounds in order to suggest that. But there's something very untrustworthy about him. It's not the amount that matters, it's that ability simply to turn on the people that he loves. The final couplet is again ambiguous. Here's how they rated him when they looked back. Sometimes he did this, sometimes he did that. The repetition of sometimes shows how ambivalent they are in their feelings towards him. The fact that they focus on his actions, he did this, did that, suggests that Armitage believes it's not just our feelings about people that matter, it's how we behave towards those people that defines how our feelings should be thought about. And love dictates that we should always be good to the person that we love. This man fails. But the title of the poem, simply called Poem, might suggest that this is universal. We're seeing this man in black and white, but actually this characteristic of hurting the people that you love might be a universal one. He might be suggesting that at some level we're all like this man. It might help us to look at the structure of the poem now. So those of you who are alert will have noticed that it's in the sonnet form. So we have an octet here and a sextet here, and the final rhyming couplet is here. A sonnet, of course, is normally a love poem, and we would expect this to be a love poem, perhaps said at the man's funeral, because it looks like he's died. That's why they are looking back. It's customary at the funeral to pronounce a eulogy, which is a celebration of the person who has died. But this, of course, is not purely a celebration. It's very balanced. It looks at all the things that the man has done. Seen here, you can see this repetition of "and" all the way through. The list can be read as an accusation. These are all the things the man did. And even though some of them are very positive indeed, the fact that they are listed in this way gives us a very negative view of them. The rhythm seems to add up to nastiness, and the final nastiness is that there seems to be no emotion here from the family he's left behind. They certainly don't seem to love him. Another technique that Armitage uses is the use of half rhyme, and we'll see here in blue I've highlighted the lines that do rhyme, but the majority of them don't. They're just part rhymes. Now, one of the reasons he could do this is to show that there was no real completeness in his relationships. If the happy family life was something we should admire, then all the lines would rhyme in the pattern that they were supposed to. But the half rhymes upset us. They show us that something is wrong. Here, for example, church doesn't rhyme with anything. It's there on its own, perhaps suggesting that the man's goodness or spirituality is missing, and that's why church can't rhyme with anything. And then the final couplet, which is where you'd most expect to find a full rhyme, deliberately rejects it, back and that. So there is no sense of completeness with this man. And then the final technique that you'll notice is the end stop lines. Normally, Armitage revels in enjambment. He's trying to get the lines to run on one to the other so that you can't guess what the rhymes are going to be, so they have a natural rhythm like speech. But here, he refuses to allow most of the lines to run on in this way. Instead, the majority of them end with full stops. That's why they're called end stop lines. Punctuation at the end of each one. There is a sort of finality in this. Each line becomes a bit like an accusation, building up to this final one, the indifference of the family he's left behind. Finally, you might notice the metre that it's written in, which is trochaic. That means that the first syllable is stressed and the next syllable is unstressed, and so on. And so each of the first syllables, by and large, are stressed. And twice he lifted 10 quid from her purse. We can see that because he starts with a stress and he ends with a stress, just how accusatory the tone is. It sounds all the way through as though Armitage, or the speaker of the poem, is accusing the person being described. As usual with Armitage, you now have to ask yourself a question. Is this a description of an isolated man, or is Armitage making a wider point about our actions and how our love or lack of love is proved through them?